Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graven, and our guest today, Dr. Nicole Lipkin, is an internationally recognized clinical and organizational psychologist, executive coach, and keynote speaker. Nicole is the author of two popular leadership books. They are What Keeps Leaders Up at Night, Recognizing and Resolving Your Most Troubling Management Issues. And the second book is Why in the Workplace. It's the letter Y, Managing the Me First Generation, quote unquote. I'm not Generation Y, so I won't take issue with that characterization. But we'll get to talk about that a little bit later. First off, welcome to the podcast. How are you, Nicole?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me, Mark. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Nicole. First off, I've got to ask, what's that say on the coffee mug? Hope that's not prying too much.
No, it's mother of the goddamn year.
Multiple award winner.
Multiple award winner. There we have. No. Single. Yeah, just one. Just
1 year.
No. Sorry. Going on 3 years. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm a mother. And I'm a mother in a pandemic. There it is.
Well, thank you for having the strength and wits about yourself to be here for doing a silly little podcast like this. Tell you a little bit more about Nicole. In terms of education, she's earned a doctorate in clinical psychology, a master's of business administration, and a master of criminal justice degree. Yeah. She is the founder and CEO of HeyKiddo, a company dedicated to helping adults gain better control over their children's mental, social, emotional health through technology. She recently exited her first company, Equilibria Psychological and Consultation Services. And as she mentioned, she has a toddler, she has a husband, and what she describes as her chunky cat, who is named, I want to just ask you to say it.
El Guapo Meatball.
How did that name come to be?
The name came to be because the person I got the cat with wanted to name him El Guapo, and I wanted to name him Meatball. And he became El Guapo Meatball.
That's a mouthful.
That's how it happened. He's certainly a meatball.
Yes. So award-winning mother and chunky cat lover, Nicole Lipkin.
That's where I am. This is where I've landed in my life.
Well, it sounds like you certainly have a lot going on, and there's a lot of interesting things you've done in your career. So looking back and thinking about it, what would you say is your favorite mistake?
Well, my favorite mistake definitely came with the company that I just exited, Equilibria Psychological. I never planned on growing that into a big practice. And what happened was I started my career in forensic psychology and loved the work. And that's how I kind of started growing the business. And then all of a sudden, I think people in my field are really weird. So I decided I didn't want to work with weird people. So I brought my friends in that were in the mental health field, and hopefully they're not weird. And we grew a practice under the umbrella of Equilibria Psych. And it was wonderful. And because we all loved each other so much, it was great. We built this amazing, amazing culture. And, we just, you can feel it when you walk into a company where people really like working with each other. And it trickled down, our reputation grew. And over the years, I decided to transition out of doing clinical and forensic work into organizational psychology. And I opened up my second company, Equilibria Leadership Consulting, doing executive coaching, leadership development, culture work. So I no longer could do the office management for the psych practice. And doing office management for a psych practice, that's taking phone calls, right? When people are vulnerable and matching them with a therapist. It's dealing with insurance billing. And when you mess up with that, that's insurance fraud, right? It's dealing with just managing the office, all of that. So it was time for me to hire. And that's when I met Hope. She was 28 and wanted to be a psychologist when she grew up. And she had no office management experience, but I could teach that. I'm a coach. I can teach that. So I had a really bad feeling when I was interviewing her, but I was also very desperate. And I ignored that and hired her. And from day one, she started screwing up. And again, screwing up's a big deal.
Yeah.
But I would take her out for coffee and I would coach her and help her problem solve. And then she would just keep on screwing up. And I had a lot of coffee that year, let me tell you. And a year into her employment. And at this point, I'm kind of losing it. I was doing 3 times the amount of work I would do if I was doing it myself, but I was traveling all over for the consulting and coaching work. And, the feel, the vibe, the culture of my organization really was declining, but I was just ignoring it. I was tunnel visioned. A year into her employment, I take her out for coffee and I say, look, I'd love to give you a raise. I can't because you keep on screwing up, but let's focus on these goals and work on it. And she said, look, she actually said this to me. She said, I completely understand I've been messing up, but and she pointed to me, you need to understand how hard it is to be 28 and have your dad pay for your credit cards, your vacations, and your phone bill. I didn't understand.
Was she joking or how?
No, I thought she was. I thought she was, but she was not. And I was like, well, why don't you work a little harder to not mess up or get another part-time job? Like, you're only doing this part-time to save more money. And she's like, but this is my fun year. And that's when I went from being at 28. That's when I went from being not a great boss at that time to a really bad one, like the movie level one. I was just leaking out all over the place. And I still didn't fire her. 3 months later, she handed in her resignation because her daddy was paying for a month-long European vacation and she was going to go find a real job. And It was such a freaking punch in the gut for so many reasons. First of all, I wrote a book on managing millennials and I couldn't manage a millennial.
You had already written the book. I thought the book came later. Oh, okay.
Yeah, no. I'm sorry. Like I couldn't do it. I was messing up. 2, I get hired to work with leadership teams and work with companies and their cultures and executives to show up great, all of that stuff. And I was not doing the same. And 3, I'm a shrink. I'm supposed to be really self-aware and in tune. And I couldn't have been less self-aware. Having said that, it was the greatest professional lesson of my life. Because stepping back, when I look in hindsight, I was so overwhelmed. I was so stressed out. I could not think straight. I was so resistant to change because it was my decision. It was like sunk cost bias. I kept on throwing things in. And I had this mindset that there was no other way around it except the way I was going. And I literally wasn't taking my company and choke holding it. Once I got some perspective and worked on these things, the company ended up growing and blossoming, and that's the company I just exited. Yeah. But I realized I wasn't alone in those leadership derailers. Those are pretty common ones. And at least she inspired the second book. I will tell you that.
Okay, she did inspire the second book then about managing Gen Y.
No, she inspired the second book about what keeps leaders up at night.
Okay. The books are in that order. Okay. So it was keeping you. Yeah. That sounds like this was keeping you up at night. At times.
I was a mess. I was all the time. I mean, because when you think about it, it is those interpersonal things. It is the stuff that you're not doing right and all of that. And it was about being too busy to win, too proud to see, and too afraid to lose. And those were pretty significant leadership derailers for me at that point. And I'm not saying I haven't had many mistakes and many failures since. It's just those, when I gained perspective of that, and they happen still, they happen to all of us.
Right.
I can see them now. I can see when they're about to happen and get in front of them.
So, wow. So, thank you for sharing the story and the reflections there. And, the point here is to talk about what we've learned from mistakes. There's a category of mistakes of, people talking about like, what's the story, the parable of the cobbler's children have no shoes.
Right.
Like there's a risk in any profession that we don't apply the ideas or the practices or the things that we're encouraging others to do. We may not be applying it to our own work. That's not too uncommon, right?
No, not at all. It's extremely, extremely common. And I think, it's funny when you look at the profession of psychology, I think we're the worst. We don't, a lot of us don't practice what we help others with. Right. So it was a real punch in the gut, that experience, but so profoundly eye-opening.
Well, I bet on so many different levels. I mean, so just kind of going back through parts of the story there, I guess there's that, the mistake of not following your gut, even during the interview, but being pressured. I mean, this happens a lot in businesses. I don't like the expression, and you didn't say it, but any warm body, sometimes you feel that pressure to fill a position, instead of
Totally.
standing by waiting to find the right person. Yeah.
Totally. And I would, there was a couple of factors there. I mean, I think, look, just psychologically speaking, when your gut is waving all the red flags, it's not psychological frou-frou. Like, it's based on wisdom. It's based on experience. Like, it's telling you something. And yeah, you think it through. It's not always right, but don't just ignore it. I did. And I think it's easier said than done to say don't hire out of desperation, because sometimes you're desperate and sometimes you really need someone. But the reality is that value fit, that culture fit, that hire, and not recognizing the expiration point and not letting go, the toxicity cost me so much money, cost me so much turmoil, and it cost my culture. And it was all my fault. It wasn't her fault. This is how she is. This is how she shows up.
You brought her in. Yeah.
It was me. And I kept her. And
you kept her. Yeah.
And it was like this, I put so much time, money, and energy in it. It was a sunk cost bias. So much time, money, and energy. I just kept on doing it because I'm like, I can change her. I can fix her. And I kept on making the excuses. So
I was about to bring that phrase up, thinking back to our each of our MBA educations. They try to teach you, ignore the sunk cost. It's the sunk cost fallacy of, I've been coaching her for a year and I want to stick with it. I don't want to admit even if you're telling yourself I made a mistake in hiring, you don't really want to admit it. Like, well, she'll get there. The cost of training somebody in interviewing and training someone new is a cost. And I could see where
it's hard.
You stick with it. But how much of it do you think is kind of, I'm going to generalize about psychologists, this idea of thinking it's your profession to want to help people and to coach them and not give up on them? And that's probably a factor then as a business leader when you've got that hat on, right?
I mean, definitely. But I think even more than that, I don't like firing people. I don't like that part of my work. I really don't. And you know what? After that, I had made some other bad promotion decisions and hiring decisions and had trouble cutting the cord, eventually over time and through experience, like that, hiring hope, that was earlier on in my career. Like, I've had some years now. I've learned some things, like I never hire alone. I just don't hire alone. I make other people that are integral to the company interview separately. And then we it's all joint. It's joint decisions because we're biased. There's so much stuff that goes in, and I just think it's important not to do it alone, and to check yourself. So
it's a good tip.
Yeah, sure. I am, this is my profession. I'm an organizational psychologist. I work with people. I don't give up on people. I know people. I believe in change and evolution, that we can all evolve. So sure, I hold on tight.
Now, if this is like a case study where you've changed Hope's name to Protect Hope,
I've protected Hope.
A clever choice, because when you said when you were hiring Hope, I guess every time we hire, there is hope that there's
hope.
There's
hope. Oh yes, I am protecting the not so innocent.
But I see what you did there. That was rather than saying Mary or whatever. So well played. So Nicole, as a leader and a coach, and you have these different businesses. You use the phrase in the title of your second book, "What Keeps Leaders Up at Night," and that's a really common question. There's probably a podcast out there called "What Keeps You Up at Night." It's such a common phrase, but like it's taken for granted. So I guess I'll ask you, what keeps you up at night, or better yet, how do we keep business pressures or whatever from keeping us up at night? Is that avoidable?
It's hard. I love talking about this topic, and how we can kind of gain better control of our own psychology to be more effective and kind of to help our lives and help our leadership and be more effective. At the end of the day, it's all of that. I think it's all of those kind of like interpersonal, stuff. Like even if it's about money, even if it's about even if it's about having to hire or fire or the growth of your company, like ultimately we're people working with people. It comes down to human beings, and it's that nagging stuff that keeps us up. But I think more importantly, it's how we interpret stuff. When I look at myself as a leader and the evolution of myself as a leader and my clients and their evolution, how we can shift the control that we do have and how we can shift our perceptions of situations. Like, for example, if we get a text message that says, we need to talk, where does your brain go?
I have a bad habit of sometimes my brain will leap to the worst case scenario, get a text from a client or a text from somebody in a work setting. And that's a bad habit. I've tried to remind myself, don't go right there.
Right. Because it's your automatic thought. Like your automatic thought is catastrophizing and like, oh my God, I did something wrong. Yeah. But if we start practicing something called divergent thinking, which scientifically helps us be happier, more open, and more agile, we start thinking, you can start forcing yourself or challenging yourself to think of alternative explanations. Like, oh, they need to talk. They're finally in their car. They're texting in their car. Whatever the alternative explanation might be. That kind of psychological mental practice actually helps us be more agile and helps us handle the crap that comes at us, that keeps us kind of hanging on at night and going over in that anxiety. And that's like just one teeny little thing. But there are things that we can do to really evolve how our brains think and help us become more mentally agile in the way we approach our reactions, our experiences, our interactions, and all of that.
Right.
But it's work.
An example of divergent thinking would be you get that text and your brain goes to a place of like, oh, they're going to pull the contract, even though you might not have any good reason for expecting why would that be true. So divergent thinking could be to say, well, they could be wanting to talk about extending the contract, or like just, whether it's something positive or just something different, or
just something different, like coming up with as many alternative explanations as possible. Like convergent thinking, the way we always think is sticking inside of our own box. Divergent forces us, and it's actually a technique used to kind of help you become more innovative in your thinking, more agile, more creative, and like kind of get out of that status quo. But our brains don't like doing that. It's a lot of energy to do that. It's easier to stay stuck in kind of that rut. There's Deepak Chopra has a quote that I absolutely adore. We have 60,000 thoughts a day, 95% of the same we had yesterday. And that's the natural human way. And that's amazing. Our brain's protective. It keeps us kind of stuck in those same patterns of thinking, because if we thought differently about everything and we let all the senses come in at any given moment, we would go clinically insane. Yeah. So it's hard. It's much harder to think that way versus just think oh crap, I'm in trouble.
Yeah. So when you talk, in that book, when you talk about in the subtitle, I think there's a parallel to the types of things we talk about here on My Favorite Mistakes. So the subtitle of the book, again, what keeps leaders up at night, recognizing and resolving your most troubling management issues. So here, we talk about recognizing the mistake, being willing to acknowledge it, talk about it, reflect on it enough as a way to then help resolve whatever led to that mistake so we can avoid repeating it. How often in working with leaders are they unable or unwilling to recognize the real core of an issue?
It can take some time.
Why is that?
I think it takes time for all of us to kind of like, it takes reflection, it takes time, it takes the development of self-awareness, which is like, a lifelong thing. But, I definitely don't let people off the hook. Yeah. It's about understanding the space someone needs to get there. But the bottom line is that everything that happens, like you can deflect all you want. Like I could have blamed Hope all I want, and Hope was a great target to blame. And
you weren't doing that, to your credit. Yeah.
No, I blamed her. I blamed her for a year and 3 months. It was only
okay. Today you weren't blaming her, but
I don't blame her now. Like it took me a while to get like, oh, Nicole, you were the problem. It's hard to always be the problem when things mess up. And look, I have to be honest with you. One of the things I get really frustrated with is that like, it's always the top. It's always a leader. It's always the executive. The truth is that life is a two-way street.
Mm-hmm.
It's always the dynamic. It's not always one person. It's always the dynamic, but it's each person owning what their stuff was in that dynamic. Mm-hmm. So I don't subscribe to the whole, like, when things aren't going well in a company or when things aren't going well in a team, it's always the leader. Yes, the leader sets the tone, all of that. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But it's the dynamic in my mind. And if we can kind of adjust and everyone can kind of gain that self-awareness of how they're contributing to that, man, can we get a lot farther? We could go a lot farther.
Yeah. So one thing, that's talked about increasingly, looking at organizational culture.
Yes.
And this is something I've tried to learn about, is this concept of psychological safety.
Yeah.
And I'm curious in your thoughts on the two-way street, where the one thing I've seen recently that I think is really problematic is when the pressure gets completely put on the employees of basically lecturing, you should feel free to speak up. And like, well, if it were only that easy,
right?
Would you agree something like that? Like, how does the building of psychological safety start more with the leaders, or how much?
Yeah, I think the building of psychological safety, like, kind of, it starts with like that psychological contract, right? And ensuring that psychological contract isn't broken. It's just kind of like, it's collectively deciding, like, here's what we're going to be, and then demonstrating and modeling. Like, we're all, it's kind of like a child, right? Your child models your behavior. Your child reflects, you have an anxious moment, you're leaking out. We mimic one another. We're contagious. We infect one another emotionally. So it is about owning it and setting the stage. And I think to create psychological safety, power exists, and being able to be vulnerable, power exists. Like, own it, right. Own it. There's different types of power, but like, even if you don't have referential power, that relationship power where people are going to jump off a bridge for you, just having positional power, just being the CEO, like, you need to, if you want people to be vulnerable, you need to be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And I think that's interesting, because one of the things, like, historically, we've always wanted our leaders to be calm, cool, and collected. You know what? When you're too calm, cool, and collected, everyone else feels weird when they're not.
Right.
So, like, I think it's just like going through COVID. I have found in myself and the leaders that I work with, the ones that have been more vulnerable are the ones whose teams have been have felt better.
Yeah.
Have had the outlet, have felt that psychological safety. And I think it's powerful stuff. And the companies that have, like, wanted to do culture assessment work with us, and like wanted to, like, kind of co-create what that blueprint's going to look like going forward, versus like, it's all top down, like, and like, let's all have a voice in this and move. I've just take leaps. They've done amazing. It's amazing stuff.
Yeah. And would you agree, or tell us a little bit more? The psychological safety is not yes, no. There's degrees,
of course,
of that in a workplace.
Of course, and I think that I think, and it's based on perception. I might perceive a relationship to be completely psychologically safe, and you might perceive that same relationship to be completely unsafe. It's all about perception. And the truth is I can't change how you feel about it. But if I am in tune enough, I can mitigate it by looking at other areas that kind of, like, I can move. Like, one of the things, there's, based on research from negotiation, there are these core emotional concerns. I'm going to nerd out on you for a minute.
Okay.
There's these core emotional concerns that we all experience because they're based on our kind of psychological development. Things like autonomy, like affiliation, appreciation, fairness, role, status, all of these things. I won't go into all the detail about it, but like, if you perceive me to take away your autonomy because you perceive me micromanaging you and not trusting you, I can't change that perception. Like, you're always going to, you're going to have always had that experience. But if I'm in tune to it and stop, like, defending against it, I can maybe mitigate it by focusing on, like, helping you feel more affiliated, or like, kind of boosting you up a little bit with your role and your status, and I can maneuver. That's why to me, leadership is not about like follow these 5 steps. It's all about understanding our own psychology and understanding group and organizational dynamics and grooving a little bit better with one another.
Mm-hmm. So maybe it's just one other question, and don't apologize for geeking out about your field. That's why you're here, and that's your field, and you've written books. So pick your brain and hear your thoughts here. But one other question on psychological safety: like how much of that is something to directly talk about with the team versus just creating the conditions where it's there without consciously talking about it? I don't know if I'm articulating this well. There's like a direct path where you would spend a lot of time consciously talking about psychological safety. We want to be a psychologically safe environment, as opposed to, let's say, never using the phrase, but doing the things that would encourage people to speak up and then make sure they're not ridiculed, punished, threatened as a result of speaking up. Like how much of it comes from, this isn't a well-formed question, so my mistake, but like sort of like the direct, we want to focus on a path versus we want to create that psychological safety, but in a less direct, less in your face.
Right. Yeah, no, I get you.
You know what I mean? Like a company that might say one of our values is that we have a culture of psychological safety, as opposed to places that have it, but it's built on other cultural norms, such as everybody is safe to speak up without fear of being ridiculed, threatened, et cetera, et cetera.
So I'm a fan of the second one, just like doing the behaviors that promote it.
Yeah.
Having said that, and like really investing in like, and in those behaviors that promote it. And you know what, when you do reviews and you do like feedback, integrating those characteristics and those kind of traits that do promote that, versus just focusing on metrics and did you meet your goals. So I'm a fan of that. Mm-hmm. Having said that, there are certain cultures, there are certain companies that are so far away from it that it requires almost like psychological safety 101. Mm-hmm. And sometimes psychological safety 101 is here's what it is. and let's learn about it. Let's learn about it. But learning about it, that's like 1 centimeter of it, because then it's like, how do you build in the accountability around it?
Right. And the consistency.
And how do you, if you have a manager that you're promoting who creates really dangerous conditions for people and toxic conditions, and you're promoting that person, or that person's remaining in a management position, you're not building psychological safety 101. Mm-hmm. So it's not just teaching it, it's talking the walk. It is all those little other things that make the difference. And I actually think it can be insulting when you just when you just want the workshop. People are smart. People pick up on this. When you just want the workshop, but you don't want to do the work.
Sure.
I would say don't do the workshop, because it's going to backfire even more.
That happens in a lot of different realms. You hear people talk about like, it's Black History Month, so you did the workshop on DE&I, but then that's the end of it. Like it's got to be a 12-month a year commit. If you're going to do the workshop, or you're going to, back to you frame this better. Are you talking about it, or are you doing the behaviors? Mm-hmm. Not just talk about, we value DE&I. What are you actually doing? Just to use that as another example.
Right. Like I think, something in my company, like we collectively have built we collectively actively work on psychological safety, because it's not just a one and done, it's you work on it. Mm-hmm. Right. But that also means that like, if I'm having a crappy day and I'm leaking out, I get called out on it.
Yeah.
Like I'll get called out if I'm running a meeting where I'm like, and I sometimes don't even realize it, where I'm like, I'm really intense in business, but like, what happened? Like that? It's so like, I'm showing up in a way that is leaking out on other people. I get called out on it.
Yeah.
And you know what? Thank you. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes I don't recognize it. And sometimes my colleague doesn't recognize that they're doing, or my other colleague doesn't recognize that they're doing it. I'll never forget, one of the most valuable lessons of my life was my brother said, do you know when you're intently listening to people, you give them dirty looks? I had no idea. So can you imagine being an executive coach, or even when I used to be a therapist years ago, and being like, when people were talking, thank you for telling me.
Right. So we could roll the video back to where I was stammering through this question I was trying to form about psychological safety. Like I was struggling with the question so much, I wasn't even focusing on whether you were if there was a dirty look, it might have been like, come on, Mark, spit out the question already.
I wasn't giving you no, I've gotten the feedback, so I know to watch my face, and Zoom's been helpful. I can see my face.
There you go. There's a lot of problems caused by having that constant mirror in front of you, maybe.
It's interesting. There's been such a, because of that, there's been a massive increase in plastic surgery and a massive increase in body image issues and with children. It's really interesting.
With kids because of Zoom school. Yeah,
because they're at a certain age, you start noticing and comparing yourself, and they're picking on everything, and it's a problem.
Well, Zoom has that touch up your appearance feature. We don't get that in real life. And I don't know how much of an effect that has.
I didn't even know it had it.
Oh, it's down in the settings. There's like a sliding scale of
Really? Well, here's what you get. This is not touch up.
Well, you're on the Zoom default settings, which is probably in the middle on that. But now if I look in the mirror, I'm like, that's not how I look on Zoom. I shouldn't be looking at my own Zoom window or a mirror too much. So let's. I'd love to ask you about your book about Gen Y, and what kind of in a nutshell. I mean, how different is Gen Y than other generations? I
mean, it's an older book, but look, every generation's different. We all have different influences. And I think, it's a long time ago. The Gen Ys are older now. But you think about it. I always like to relate, they walk through metal detectors to get to school. That's different, right? During their formative years, it was 9/11. And it's not that the boomers didn't have their incredible scares, hiding under desks, during bomb scares, things like that. I don't know what we had as Gen Xers.
Gen X? Gen X, we had the threat of nuclear war.
We had nuclear war.
That movie, The Day After, and War Games, and that was hanging over our heads still.
War Games was the best movie. We had that. So every generation has it. But I think some of the educational shifts, where, when we were growing up, or boomers were growing up, like, you messed up in school. Oh man, you were held accountable. Things shifted a little bit. I mean, not saying that every parent did this, but now the teacher was held accountable. I remember, I was a professor at a university for a little bit, an adjunct, and I was teaching a forensic psych class when I was doing forensics. And I failed a student because she plagiarized. And I caught her, she plagiarized Aristotle. The only reason why I knew it was Aristotle was because I love the movie Legally Blonde. And there's a line, law is not free from passion. And she started her research paper on that.
Without attribution. Yeah.
Yes. And the dean wanted me to change the grade because the mom called and freaked out.
Helicopter parent.
Yeah. So like, that's different. Like for the book, we talked to this one karate school instructor that teaches young kids, and he had to start adding lines to the belts because kids weren't moving up quick enough, or taking out goalies in soccer, or little soccer. I don't know what it's called, not little league. That's different. I mean, every generation's different. Social media, like now the newer generation, why was digital natives? I don't even know what this generation's gonna be called. How we get our news, being able to use critical thinking and discern the difference. Every generation's different. Every generation evolves. I do think one thing that has happened though is because of technology and because our ability to sign off and not deal with conflict and not have this and our distractions for it and the addictive quality of it, you're seeing, I think there's an emotional intelligence decline. Because this is how you learn emotional intelligence. You have conflict. you need to learn how to flex. My cat's scratching my chair. Chunky meatball.
El Guapo meatball there. Hello.
So I think like there's obviously consequences to the shifts in generations as there have been. And we need to be mindful of that. And that affects workplaces. This affects organizations and how we recruit and how we attract. We need to be thoughtful about this. But I do think one of the things, especially with, Great Resignation, all of that, I always say this, like, until the robots take over, it's humans, it's human beings. We're human beings working with human beings. So it still comes back to basic human needs and wants. And if we can really get there, that's the sticky stuff about culture. That's the sticky stuff about attracting and retaining people.
Yeah. So looking forward, you said that book, has been out for a while. Whatever label, whatever next generation, whatever next young cohort that comes into the workplaces, is a fair summary of what you're saying is that there are certain consistent human needs that are always going to be there, but then every generation is going to have sort of its own influences and respond to the same situation in different ways. We need to try to learn that as older managers.
Yeah, sure. But it comes down to basic human needs. It comes down to basic human needs. It's kind of what I was saying, like being appreciated, being affiliated, being autonomous, like the sense of power and control of your role. Like these are basic human needs.
And I've taken issue with that at times where you see articles of, one example would be like, millennials want to have their voice heard in the workplace. And like, well, I think that was probably true of the baby boomers I worked with when I was young and they're still in the workforce. And so when it bothers me when some of those, what you're describing as basic human needs, get attributed to as if they've been just discovered by this generation. Maybe this younger generation is just louder about saying, I want this. And the boomers have been beaten into submission a little bit.
Well, if you look at the environmental conditions, like it wasn't necessarily, there were environmental conditions, like there was, hierarchy was a little bit more common. Like it was, some things were taboo, but it's still basic human needs. Whether or not they did speak up was different. It's more accepted now to speak up. Look, Xers and boomers might roll their eyes, but it is more expected. It's expected. So I think it's more about the environmental shifts and the cultural shifts, but ultimately humans have needs. And that's why I do this work. That's why I think psychologists consulting with organizations and organizational psychologists, like this is human dynamics here.
Yeah. So before we wrap up, and again, our guest has been Dr. Nicole Lipkin. I want to talk about HeyKiddo, but first tell us on the theme of organizational psychology, Equilibria Leadership Consulting, who's your ideal client? Why do they bring you in?
Oh, well, we're size and industry agnostic because we want to remain unbiased and agile and nimble. But we do, our sweet spot, we do executive coaching, executive assessment, leadership development. And one of our other sweet spots is the culture assessment and like helping companies co-create that blueprint and figure out what are the immediate, short, mid, and long-term initiatives that will really shift a culture that everyone wants. And here comes El Guapo Meatball across the desk. He's about to appear soon. So there he is.
For those who are just listening to the podcast, you're missing out. The cat just peeked in and nope, I guess wants no part of me.
And you're about to see the meatball part of him. He sleeps on the bed all day. And this is when he makes his appearance. All right, buddy.
Does not care.
There we go. So Equilibria Leadership Consulting, and we're organizational psychologists that have clinical backgrounds and been at this for years and love it.
For those who were just listening, I'm gonna Nicole's I'm gonna make a clip of the cat coming through. We'll do a little short clip. Even if you listen to the whole episode, go to the episode page and look at the El Guapo Meatball highlights. You got to see the cat. I'm glad the cat was here. So you're working with organizations and adults, and you're also working with parents and children. Tell us about HeyKiddo.
Yeah. So the parent and children. So HeyKiddo is a startup, and it kind of exists between Equilibria Leadership and the business I just sold, Equilibria Psychological. Because social emotional leadership development it's done across the lifespan. So what we're trying to do with this startup is help adults better control their children's mental, social, and emotional health, and through technology. Actually getting off technology to do the talking, but through the information they get on the technology. And we recently just won a National Science Foundation grant. And we have, we're trying to tackle the childhood mental health crisis, actually. So that's what we're doing. And again, it came from, working with organizations and hearing the same complaints around young professionals entering the workforce, but also looking at, on the clinical side, the escalating crisis that's occurring with children. And if we can help the people that help children and are with children be better in tune with what's going on, so they can get early intervention and build the skills in their children and themselves to model it, the skills that help against life challenge, these social emotional leadership skills, we can shift the course of this crisis. So that's what we're doing, and that's what we're trying to tackle.
So a really serious topic. And so I want to end on a cat joke again after.
Please.
So, well, first off, hey-kiddo.com is the website there. There'll be a link in the show notes, and equilibrialeadership.com. Is there a business idea about how to control your cat and keep them off of your Zoom call, or cats are just going to cat? Cats are just going to cat, but let's see what we can do about it.
Well,
I think El Guapo Meatball walking across the screen was not the biggest mistake anyone's made a podcast. This happens in our work from home
it does
era. It's the first time I've had a cat walk across the screen, but hey.
Yeah. And it's good. It adds some laughter. Like, hey, it lightens everyone up a little bit. This is life now.
It is. So, Nicole, thank you so much again. Dr. Nicole Lipkin, EquilibriaLeadership.com. That rolls right off the tongue. Sorry for my mistake.
So easy.
Nicole,
thank you so much for having me, Mark.
This has been fun. Thank you.
Thank you.